Hi, I know you're shocked. It's not a serger. But today I want to introduce you to one of my very favorite decorative threads. It's a thread called Spagetti by WonderFil threads. And I have developed two artist palette packs. One is called Paint Box with bright and bold colors with 10 different colors in this pack. And the second one that we'll be using today is Bayside Blooms with softer pastels, also 10 spools in the pack. And each one is about 110 yards. And let me tell you a little bit about Spagetti thread. That's the name of this particular one. It's a 12-weight Egyptian cotton thread that is just spectacular to use, and you can use it in your sewing machine, your serger, and even your sashiko machine. And I know people who use sashiko have always wanted to be able to use bolder, heavier threads. This is the one for you. So, and we'll be doing a future video on that. But the reason I love WonderFil threads is that they're double gassed. And what that means is that in the process of making the threads, they burn the lint off twice. So it's a very clean thread and it's strong. It's got a very tight twist to it, very smooth, and that's actually what you're seeing on my top today. And we'll show you a couple of other things. And you might have seen a post I did on Instagram a couple of weeks ago with my wall hanging, my collage wall hanging, and that featured all decorative stitching done with one color of the Bayside Blooms pack. So before we start, I'm going to show you the project that I have been working on. This is a purchased shawl, and it perfectly plain, but I'm going to show you how to take it from this to making it so beautiful with decorative stitches in your sewing machine to this. And this would make a fantastic holiday gift or birthday gift, whatever, because the shawl itself is purchased, and so all you're doing is adding the decorative stitching, which is really kind of fun to do, and you can create any kind of stitching you want. Now, the machine I'm working on is the Bernina 790. That has hundreds of decorative stitches. But if you have a machine that only has a few decorative stitches along with your utility stitches, don't despair. You would be amazed at how beautiful utility stitching can look when you put in a top stitch needle and use a fantastic decorative thread. You can get the most incredible effects from it. So even if you don't have a machine with hundreds of decorative stitches, no problem whatsoever. You're going to love the results. So let's talk about some of the different things that you'll need for this. The first thing is, for your machine, number one on the hit parade when it comes to decorative stitching is make sure you have a full bobbin of bobbin thread. And the bobbin thread is much lighter weight than even your regular sewing machine thread. WonderFil makes a great one called Deco Bob, but if you have a favorite bobbin thread, that will work fine. Just make sure your bobbin is full when you start. Also, you want to make sure that you're using the right stabilizer. I like Sulky's Sticky Fabri-Solvi Wash Away Stabilizer. It sticks to the fabric, and I've gotten really good results with it. I know there are other brands that carry a similar stabilizer, so whichever one you prefer is fine. For marking the first line, and believe it or not, that's all you have to mark is your first line, I used a Friction Fine Line heat erasable pen, and because you have to mark your fabric on the right side. So, and using a 9014 top stitch needle is definitely a must. And keep a few ready because I like to switch out my needle after I've stitched one side of my shawl and put a fresh one in before I do the second side. I think you'll always get a much better looking stitch with a fresh needle. So I used a Schmetz top stitch 9014 needle with the bigger eye that will accommodate that 12-weight thread. Another important thing that I want to mention before we go to the machine and the table is that because this is a purchased shawl, I had to find some scrap fabric, which believe me, I've got tons of, but something that was similar in drape and in weight so that I could test all of my stitches and the stitch settings. And you'll see that I do adjust stitch length and tensions on some of the stitches. But I can't emphasize enough how important testing on your scrap fabric is, and use that stabilizer on your scrap fabric so that you get a true read on it and you don't end up with any little bird's nests underneath the fabric, because using the right stabilizer is so important with decorative stitching, whether you're just doing it with a regular weight thread, but especially with a heavier 12-weight thread. So I think that's the end of all of my tips for that right now. Before we start and I get the other side prepared for our stitching, here's the side that I stitched out already. Here is my beginning line with the friction pen, and I measured up 2 inches from the edge. Now there's no right or wrong on that measurement. If you want to start a little closer or farther away, that's perfectly fine. I just kind of fiddled around with what I wanted and came up with 2 inches, and I thought that was good. And I still have the wash away stabilizer on the back of this. But the other thing that I wanted to show you is that the shawl at full width is about 22 inches wide from side to side. But you can see that even with the stabilizer, because I've got 10 lines of decorative stitching on this, it's drawn in a little bit, and the finished width of this, again with the stabilizer, is 21 inches. So I lost about an inch of width on this. So, and speaking of width and length and maintaining those original dimensions, I suggest washing and drying your shawl prior to your stitching, just to make sure that if you have a fiber that's going to possibly shrink, you get all of that out before you do your stitching, so that you don't have it looking funky and not a nice finished product on that. I did not know what the fiber content was on this. I must have taken off the tag beforehand, and I don't remember what it was. So anyway, let's go to the other side. You can still see on the back side of this, though, I still have my stabilizer, and against the cream color, you can barely see it, but it is still here. So let's get the other end set up for stitching. And this is where I think that having a gridded mat really makes a lot of difference, because this is a very soft drapey fabric. I have a feeling there's a lot of rayon in this, but I want to make sure that my stitching line, when I take out the stabilizer, is straight. So what I'm doing is I'm going to get this set up on the table and make sure that lengthwise as well as crosswise is perfectly straight. So that's what I'm doing, and I'm being kind of fussy and taking my time about making sure that it's not distorted at all, because I do want it to look really beautiful when it's done, because the stitching is so spectacular. I just love it. So I am really going to just make sure that everything is nice and even. And I want to make sure that this line is going to be perfectly straight, because that will determine whether my line is straight. Which, okay, I think I'm pretty happy with that. I think that looks good. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure up 2 inches, and this line is being drawn on the right side because I'm going to be stitching from the right side. I have my little friction pen. Again, I'm just double checking to make sure I'm happy with the straightness of this. And I'm just going to draw a light red line right across it. And that's the only line I need, because then I'll use the edge of my presser foot for my guide for the next lines, the subsequent lines of stitching. And while I'm talking about presser feet, double check your machine and make sure you're using the correct one for your decorative stitching, because a standard foot that's flat on the bottom may cause some drag and distort your fabrics. Now I've already cut a piece of my stabilizer, the width I need, and there's a paper protector on it for the adhesive side. So I'm going to pull that off, flip my fabric to the wrong side, and I'm going to readjust it to make sure, again, that it's nice and straight. Again, when you're putting the stabilizer on, that's exactly the contour it's going to maintain. So take your time and be a little bit fussy about this step, because it can make a difference. And your shawl may not have absolutely 100% perfect edges on it, but as long as it's close, I think you should be in good shape. Let me just move this up a smidge. Okay, so I can barely see my 2-inch line, and I want to put my stabilizer just a little bit below that line. So I'm going to put it, and I know the width of this is perfectly fine for all 10 lines of stitching. So I'm going to get that a little closer to the edge of the fabric, and just be super careful about laying it down. And now I'll just give it a nice firm smoothing with my fingers. And I think we should be ready to go to the sewing machine. This is really hard to see because it matches. And the other thing that I wanted to mention also is the only color I did not use in my paint box series was the ecru one, because I thought it would get lost on the creaminess of the color of the shawl. So that's the only one I didn't do, but I repeated the first color twice. So I think we're ready to go to the machine. I'm all set up at the machine. I have my bobbin thread in and my first color, and I actually made a little chart, and I'll put a blank one as a downloadable for you also, because I found that this was very helpful. What I have is the order of the thread colors, and I actually have them set up in order on my table next to my machine so that I can grab them. I put the spaghetti thread color next, what the stitch number is that I've chosen from my different menus. This machine has 8 different decorative stitch menus. I put my stitch length because I adjusted it. 12 weight thread is heavier than your standard all-purpose thread. And so you may need to lengthen your stitch a little bit, which I did in many of the cases, and I wrote it down. I kept the stitch width at 9, which was the default setting for each of these stitches. And I did lower the tensions a little bit on some of the stitches to get the best look. So I made notes of all of that. So having this as a reference is really great because, and your machine settings may be different if you have a different machine. They probably definitely will be. But it is kind of nice to have a system for how to record these. And that way you'll know when, say you go from one side of your shawl to the other, or if you're doing decorative stitching on a different project. It's kind of nice to have this as a handy guide. And I think I am all set to start. So I am going to start with stitch number 415. And I have my stitch length on 18, so I'm going to lengthen, the default setting is 12.6 for the stitch length. So I'm going to bring that, up to 18. And my stitch width is 9, and the default tension on this is 2.25, so I'm going to tick that down to 2, which I think is a good setting for that. And now I am ready to go. So I'll put this off to the side as a little bit. And the reason I like to start on the side that's closest to the fringe is that way I know for sure I've got enough room to work with these 12 weight threads and the width of each stitch. So what I'm doing is I am starting in from that selvage edge just a little bit. I'm going to put my foot down and make sure I am right where I need to be. Okay, I am all set up. I am using the edge of my presser foot right along my little drawn red line as my guide, and I think I am ready to roll. So, and I pulled up my bobbin thread, and I have my spaghetti thread tail right down here, so I think let's give it a whirl. And one thing I have learned about decorative stitching is don't try to push the machine along in the direction you think it should be going for the stitch. Let the machine do it. It's all programmed into your machine. So all you have to do is just make sure that your presser foot is going right along your little guideline. That's all that really matters on this. Don't try to pull the fabric from the back or push it along. Let the machine do the stitching the way it wants to go. Okay, I'm just going to lock that off. And what I'm going to do is just bring this up. And I like to leave a nice long thread chain. So I just clip it. I do have an automatic thread cutter, but I'm not going to use that. So I've got my first line of stitching done. Looks great. So now I am going to consult my chart, and I actually did put my threads in order on the table here so that I could grab them in the right order. I'm all set up with my next color, which is 42. It's that pretty green that I mentioned. And now just to show you how I align the stitches so that I have straight rows, I'm going to let the edge of my presser foot be my guide right along the bottom edge of the previous line of stitching. So I'm all set to go. And I actually think it's kind of pretty to vary what type of stitch you're doing. Again, that's a matter of personal taste. But I like something bold and geometric, and then kind of do something a little more open and maybe scrolly or curvy. I think it's a nice contrast. Thanks for joining me today. And my next step is to wash out the stabilizer on both edges of the shawl. And I will post a picture. And I'm also going to do a measurement of the width of the shawl with all the stitching on without the stabilizer. So thanks for joining me. The two collections of the 12 weight spaghetti thread by WonderFil, Bayside Blooms, and Paint Box are available on my website in my store. Thanks very much. We'll see you again soon.